It helps leaders that are above the middle leader team realize that one of their jobs is to become what I would call little mini chief development officers themselves. Some organizations will have OD, organizational development, learning and development, and often we punt to those departments and we say, you're responsible for learning and development. Well, they're really responsible for creating content. But it's really my boss. If you look at all the research, including that one from Gallup that you just referenced a while ago, if I've got a good relationship with my boss and my boss demonstrates care and concern for my development, chances of me leaving the organization drop to almost nothing.
The business of healthcare is hard, creating a badlands of terrain that is difficult to navigate. Some think the most brilliant minds in business are on Wall Street. They are wrong. The most brilliant minds are in healthcare. They have to be to thrive and survive. This podcast explores concepts in leadership, management, sales, and negotiation with those brilliant minds. The Healthcare Badlands podcast is generally planned, but unscripted, unedited, and uncut, so you get the honest and unfiltered experience. Your host is Dr. Tom McDougall, a 30-year veteran of healthcare with 23 years of hospital CEO experience. His guests are carefully selected experts from across the industry. They offer insights, expertise, and some great real-life, often hilarious stories. Now, let's jump into the episode.
Welcome to the Healthcare Badlands podcast. Really happy today to have Dan Collard with us. Dan is a co-founder and partner with Quint Studer in the Healthcare Plus Solutions Group. And many of you may recognize his name from back in the days of the StuderGroup. And so, Dan, so glad to have you with us.
Hey, it's great to be here. I'm often reminded how small the world healthcare is. I was just thinking about the fact that you and I met in 2007, so even 10 years before 2017 there.
Yeah, it has been quite a while. Well, talk to, I think the listeners will recognize your name, but talk to what you've been up to since 2017.
Yeah, we had an opportunity to be acquired by Huron Consulting back in 2017. And after I made my exit from that organization about 2 years later, I had a chance just to do some things different. So I had an opportunity to go down to Atlanta and be the CEO of a healthcare technology startup. We had created an app for physicians that would aggregate patient medical record data from across all disparate platforms so that the physician would get one view. So it was really about efficiency for physicians. And I was essentially brought in to also create an exit strategy for that organization. They were in a startup phase, like many are. And so after we did that, I sent a note out to some folks that, I was just looking to do something where I could have some fun. And I had the opportunity to be invited to come over and become the president of the consulting arm of Press Ganey. And, it was a great time there as well, working with folks like Dr. Jim Merlino and Joe Griscoviac, among others. But as I, shared with you, and as most folks know me, I'm really an operator at heart. And throughout both of those wonderful experiences, operations sort of kept, it was an itch that kept getting not scratched there. And so I had an opportunity to go back into operations and become part of the executive team of a large hospital-based physician organization that focused on emergency medicine, hospital medicine, anesthesia, some post-acute work. So I had a chance to be on the team health team for a while. And a couple of interesting things happened when I was at Team Health. A lot of our partners, as you can imagine, were also former StuderGroup partners. And it was not unusual to get a call from a client that said, "Hey, are you still speaking across the country? Do you still do work in leadership development?" And of course, the answer was yes, and had the opportunity to go and revisit some friends across the country there. And then along that way, Quint and I had always stayed in contact with each other and always kind of were interested in what the other was doing. Of course, Quint had really immersed himself in the work called Building a Vibrant Community with his work there in Pensacola and across the country, where cities and towns were really trying to hold on to their young folks there. But we happened to have a phone call and decided there was more work to be done sort of in the vein of the work that we had done previously. And so before you knew it, we had decided to create a new organization. And that, of course, is the one you referenced earlier, Healthcare Plus Solutions Group. Started up about 3.5 years ago and have just had so much fun being sort of back in that space, but not back in the old space necessarily, really thinking about what the healthcare industry needs today the most.
Excellent. Well, and I know you're doing a podcast as part of that. So you did mention that, but would you tell us about your podcast? I've listened to a couple episodes. It's good stuff.
Yeah, that's what's fun about today because I'm usually on your side of the microphone as the host. So Quint and I take turns hosting what we call the Healthcare Plus podcast. And the intention is to sort of model our company's name. We're called Healthcare Plus Solutions Group. So the intention of the podcast is to always bring about a solution. So whether it's healthcare industry experts, whether it's folks from outside healthcare that we think we could learn from, it's another part of just the fun that we're having as we get to host folks that we know and folks that we're just getting to know.
Yeah, interesting. Very good. All right, so I actually have this burning question I've been wanting to ask you for like 15 years. So I'm going to ask you the question.
Okay.
You mentioned that we met back in 2007, 2008. I moved to a different hospital within the same system. And at that hospital, I inherited a pretty good set of challenges. Even though it was a flagship facility, we had to rebuild several things. One of the great distinctions, shall we say, is that from the quality and satisfaction metrics that we were measuring, of 118 hospitals in our system, my hospital was ranked 117th. So not where you want to be. That's the opposite of number one. So team really bared down on it. And one of the things that we did was really lean in on the StuderGroup publications and your methodology for lack of a better term, attacking the problem of the quality and satisfaction scores. I don't know what word you would use. That's the one I would use because, again, we're 117th out of 118. But I did something that to this day, I don't know if what I did was unusual or stubborn or what, but I went through your books with a highlighter and chose the things I liked. And that's what we actually did. But was that unusual, or was that pretty common with your clientele that you were working with at that time?
When we had our early publications, they sort of became textbooks for guys
Right.
like you. They sort of became, here's, not just theory, but here's the how-to.
Yeah, it was a
And so I would,
playbook. It was it
yeah,
was a practical playbook. Absolutely.
yeah. So I'm going to give you what I think it is. So I think, first of all, you were doing it the right way. And I remember where I was sitting the first day that I saw you present on the turnaround at that hospital. I remember exactly where I was sitting in Franklin, Tennessee. And I remember your data points. I remember you talking about the community that you were in, the challenges that you faced economically, socioeconomically, et cetera. Probably all the reasons that most hospital operators would have for not succeeding. But you did something else, and that was part of that larger 118 hospital effort there. This became leadership led. So it wasn't like Tom took a highlighter and, picked out the things that he liked and then turned it over to the team and said, here, you go do this. Instead, as you remember, we had a very aligned playbook and a very aligned process by which we would go about improving. And you led it from the top. You led it from you and your team's offices, as opposed to just saying, hey, these tactics sound like they'll work. Why don't you guys go try them there? And I think that's the difference, because even in that organization of 118 hospitals, you had some like yourself that pulled off some significant turnarounds. And then you had some others that didn't see that sort of level of improvement. And almost to a one, I could almost predict what that would look like when I got to go visit those hospitals in person. It was the CEO couldn't make the meeting in the morning because they had, something more important to do. Or the CNO had really turfed most of this off to the nurse managers to do. And that's really the most easy to recognize line of demarcation, that when this work is leadership led, it has such better odds of succeeding per, your own proof in the pudding there at that hospital in South Carolina.
Yeah, and I never took credit for it because I didn't feel like I did anything. That's the weird thing about those hospital CEO jobs is that very early in my career, I realized that in terms of care being provided to patients on any given day at any moment during that day, the least important person in the building is the CEO of the hospital. Because if the CEO were to suddenly get up out of their chair in their office and walk out of the building and leave for the rest of the day, I don't think a single patient would realize the CEO wasn't in the building. So you were really the least important person from a quality and satisfaction perspective at any given moment of any given day. And the team is the one that did it. And it wasn't, and I love my executive team there. They're fantastic. I still keep in touch with just about all of them, but it wasn't them either. It was the department directors. And it took us about, I don't remember exactly. It probably was somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks that we started talking about, we've got to do better on quality and satisfaction. And we really focused in on, we didn't care what our scores were. We cared enormously about making sure that we provided excellent care and excellent service to each patient individually. And until I heard the department managers say, we're going to do something about this. And once they said that, I was like, all right, let's go. But until then, it was a lot of lip service because I didn't feel the buy-in, but it has to be that department level commitment, which makes me a little bit worried now because the Gallup data out there that just got released about a month or two ago is showing that the biggest group that's facing burnout issues now is those same department manager level folks. And I'm starting to really worry about that because that's where healthcare organizations are successful or fail, is right there.
Yeah, it's both the offensive and the defensive line. They play both roles. And it's like that player that goes both ways, offense and defense there. We are beyond a shadow of a doubt convinced that organizations that create the strongest middle leader team are the ones that win.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, let's skip to another burning question I've always had. I guess I could have just called you rather than record a podcast to ask my questions, but now everybody gets to hear the answer too. My other question was, and remind me, what year did you and Quint kind of join forces and really start pushing with the StuderGroup initiatives? Because I don't remember what year that was.
So Quint founded the StuderGroup in 2000. He had been the president of Baptist Hospital there in Pensacola. Started the group in 2000. He and I actually knew each other before there was a StuderGroup. I was an operator. I had been recruited by HCA to be part of LifePoint, and so we actually first met in 1998. My hospital was the very first hospital that was a proprietary or for-profit hospital that Quint had the opportunity to visit, and a friendship had been born. And so he started the company in 2000, and then in late 2003, he and I started talking about what value that operators would bring the organization. Because, when you can walk into the office of an operator and they know that you speak their language, boy, it just gives you a head start.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and it gets you in the door because if you're not one of them, it's harder to get in the door. So, yeah, I think it's excellent that both of you came from that background because it's more realistic. But here's my question is, when you started down that path, for lack of a better phrase, it was before it was cool. What I really mean is it was before all the quality metrics and the satisfaction metrics were publicly shared. And it was before the point where kind of healthcare organizations woke up and said, not only is it publicly shared, we don't look so good, so we need to do something about this. So you started before that, and obviously, StuderGroup was extremely successful. Huron wanted you, so that's a statement in itself. But do you think your success is attributed to the quality of the solution that you had, or to the fact that you just happened to have outstanding timing and you rode a really nice wave of change in the industry, or a combination of both?
Yeah, it could have been a little bit of both, but I'll tell you what we were for sure able to tap into. Because I loved how you led. It wasn't about chasing the scores. What we were able to tap into is what just darn near every single person in healthcare comes to the job with, and that's that passion. And so you remember we talked an awful lot about this flywheel effect that we borrowed from Jim Collins, and we sort of made it a version for our industry, if you will. And then at the end of the day, as someone's heading to the car, whether it's a nurse, a nurse aide, a phlebotomist, a housekeeper, a back office finance person, there was that whole sense of being able to ask three questions. Did today I have the right purpose? Did today in my job I do worthwhile work? And did it feel like today I made a difference? And I think that's what we really tapped into early on, because as you remember reading in our early works, people had become FTEs, patients had become adjusted discharges. And we had sort of, when you looked at this, there's this study that's been done every year for the last couple of decades by ACHE, and it's the top issues facing hospital CEOs. And our job back then, we said, was to put the patient on the list. Because if you looked at those first couple of years of the ACHE study that they did, number one, it was always finance. And then, of course, there was the payer relationships. There was the structural vertical integration, horizontal integration, everything we were trying to do, re-engineering. And what was so amazing is when you looked at the first several years of that study, two things were missing: the patient and the employee. Now, fast forward that to today, and for the last 3 years, as you might guess, coming out of the pandemic, number one issue, people, workforce. But back then, it wasn't on the radar. And so I would say we got really fortunate that we were tapping into the innate passion that folks from healthcare bring. And then, of course, you just referenced the advent of publicly reported data. And I'll never forget, I was at a partner organization down in Oklahoma City, and the front cover top story, so front page top story of the Daily Oklahoman, were these newly released HCAHPS results from the entire market. And the partner that we happened to be working with was on the wrong end of the list, let's say. Yep. And it got under their skin. It was a little bit of a pride factor. But most importantly, the people that got that part right, back to your earlier reference to the connection between satisfaction or experience and quality, also began to emerge, because guess what the other metrics were that had become publicly reportable? Quality metrics there as well.
Yeah. Well, and they're all, it's a three-legged stool. So your finance, your patient experience, and the quality indicators, they all have to be pursued equally. And not everybody likes to hear that. But, I've always recognized that if you're dealing with financial challenges, guess what you don't have? You don't have resources to improve patient experience nor quality. You don't, because you're so focused on the finance piece. But in the flip side of that is if you spend so much time and attention and resources on quality and the satisfaction components, then it's going to impact your finance side. So it's got to be an equal weight approach to improving all, because a stool that is 2 feet tall, if you want the finance to be 3 feet tall, well, you need your quality and your satisfaction to also go to that 3-foot level. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. There's not a lot, though, in the StuderGroup about the finance side, other than it's, tied to quality and satisfaction. If you achieve those, you'll achieve your finance goals. So how did you balance that and the approach that you took when you were talking to different folks about it?
Well, not only then, but now, we borrowed an illustration from Clay Sherman, who wrote the book, The New American Hospital. And it was essentially taking the Kaplan balance scorecard illustration of, how do you balance what you focus on within an organization? And of course, what Clay had done is he had converted those to pillars. And the pillars sort of became that ubiquitous illustration in so many hospitals. Whether we worked with them officially or not, it's always fun to walk in a hospital and see the pillars. The importance of the pillars was that it made it make sense to the folks in the trenches, the folks on the front line. The folks in the C-suite should pretty much be able to read a dashboard, know the metrics, et cetera. But how do you translate that to the direct caregiver so that it makes sense? And so, we focused on people and service and quality and finance and growth. And the whole sense was the conventional wisdom is if you worked really hard on the first three, the last two were a lot easier to achieve. Now,
Yep,
you
that's true.
fast forward again through the last 4 years, everything we've been through since March of 2020, and the rules of the road have changed a little bit. Sort of, I think the individual elements of the balanced scorecard, some have risen, some have fallen. And if you look today, you know, while salaries, wages, and benefits and supply costs have always been the big two in terms of the expense structure,
Right.
no more time than today are we seeing retention, the opposite side of the coin, turnover, use of contract labor, et cetera, being an even greater driving force. And then, the whole supply chain, which, is really, quite frankly, out of the realm of influence, out of the sphere of influence of most hospital leadership teams. Hopefully you have a good GPO. Hopefully the tariffs don't hit you too bad. But it's the people piece that I think today really, it's where we've chosen to hang out. When people ask what we're doing with the new organization, I say we spend about 3/4 of our time inside the people pillar. Because it's not just saying, what can we do to reduce turnover? What can we do to hold on to folks so that we don't have contract labor? It really is asking the question, what are the skills that a leader needs to be effective? Because while the news sort of brought this term, the Great Resignation, during the pandemic to be one of the new phrases we heard an awful lot about, what many organizations didn't realize is that they were losing their leaders. They saw the staff leaving in drove. What they didn't realize is they were losing their leaders. And so it's one of our diagnostics today. We'll ask a question of an organization, what percent of your leaders are new to that role in the last 24 months? And I got to tell you, sometimes the numbers are staggering. We're seeing an average of 35 to 40% of that middle manager leadership team that you referenced a while ago. We see on average 35 to 40% of those teams are new. And it's kind of interesting because when I ask a CEO that, he or she will typically say, well, I don't think we've lost too many. I don't think the number's that big. And there's good reason for that. When you think about, for instance, hospital orientation, and you think about those orientation classes every other Monday or whenever they are, the big number is always the front line, the employees. When we're hiring leaders, those are typically onesie, twosie. And so over the course of 3 or 4 years, it can really sneak up on you. Probably the most extreme example we saw, we were working with a large academic medical center on the Eastern Seaboard, and not knowing what was about to happen in early 2020, they opened up a brand new freestanding children's hospital end of January of 2020. And so when we asked that same leadership question of them, and they had HR run the numbers, it was one of those that just blows you back against your seat. They had seen 127% churn of
Holy
the
cow.
leadership team, which means there was nobody there that was there the day they opened the hospital. And so when you think about how do we manage the financial headwinds, how do we tackle supplies, et cetera, we see it really being anchored in leader skill building because you got all these new leaders on your hands.
This episode is sponsored by CO Management Solutions, a revenue cycle company you may not have heard of, but you need to hear this. There is little healthcare organizations can do about inflation-related expenses, but you can make sure you're collecting 100% of your revenue you have earned. CO uses AI and the latest technology paired with an efficient team to aggressively collect your hard-earned revenue at an attractive commission. Start today with a free analysis of what you are leaving uncollected and recover that revenue quick with CO. For more information, visit coms.com. That is SCIOMS.com. How are you approaching that with your new organization? Because that's a severe weakness, particularly of hospitals, is that, and I hate to say it's the Dilbert principle, but to some extent it is. So you have this amazing MRI technician who then you promote into a supervisor role, and they do a nice job in that role. And then you make them an assistant director in the department, if you've got 60, 70, 80 people in the department, and then your director decides she's going to retire, and you do a search, and the assistant director has been the interim for 3 months, and somebody decides, hey, this is a really good idea. We're just going to make this person the director. But then there's no training.
Yeah.
And too many times that person wasn't ready for that next big step from the assistant director to director. And being
Yeah.
the interim, that's not really being the permanent person. Completely
Yeah.
different experience. So what is your organization doing to help hospitals in particular with dealing with that challenge?
Well, number one, we've always seen it as a values call. Much to the credit of that organization you were at when I first met you, there was a pretty significant investment in leadership development for, at the time, 5,400 leaders in the organization. And it was a very strategic, very deliberate investment in leadership development. But we've always seen it as a values call. We often say you can tell an awful lot about the values of an organization, regardless of what's on the website, mission, vision, values, but regardless of the plaques that hang in the front hallways there. Here's something that I'd love everyone to really consider. You can tell an awful lot about the values of an organization based upon the investment in leader training, in leader development, because it's the exact opposite of he or she was a really good fill in the blank, let's make them the boss. And we know the failure rate for those kinds of folks. And so for some reason, and I'm not sure, what maybe the real answer is, those are the kinds of organizations that have always been attracted to our work. The ones that maybe they just needed to figure out how to do it. Maybe they needed to realize it wasn't going to be as expensive as they thought it was going to be. And then once they start, and I'll give a shout out to a former partner of ours, Memorial Health System in Hollywood, Florida. Right after Quint and I got back together, we got invited to come down and speak at Memorial. And it was one of the neatest things ever. They had gone to virtual during the pandemic. So this was their very first in-person LDI, or Leadership Development Institute, like most folks know it as, since the pandemic. There's about 900 leaders in the room. We walked into the room, and there's these two Jumbotron screens, and it said LDI number 82. They had never quit doing the work. They had engaged us. They were about probably the second or third partner way back in 2000, 2001. And once they started, they never quit. LDI number 82.
That's
And
awesome.
it's sort of a myth buster, because, a lot of times when you start down this path, you get questions like, well, aren't we going to run out of stuff to talk about? Or, are you just going to keep loading us up with, new learning? And we always have to remember a couple things. You always have new folks coming on. And so you have to think about how do you bring those folks in, and how do you replenish the leaders that have been there. But let me answer your question specifically, because this is probably the thing that we're absolutely most excited about. And it comes from, as you might guess, a Quint story. Shortly after we got back together, Quint received a cancer diagnosis. And it really, it worried all of us. Now, let me tell the audience, all good news. Quint's doing great.
Good.
But in the course of his journey, he was advised by a really talented cancer navigator that said, I need you to do two things. One, get off, WebMD. And two, think of yourself as an N of one. And Quint learned the magic, the science and the art of precision medicine. That whole notion that it wasn't just him in a room full of 15 other cancer patients getting the same intervention. This intervention was going to be designed around his own biomarkers, basically your own genetic makeup. And that's why precision medicine has become so powerful. A couple of years back, we asked the question, could we do the same thing for leadership development? And if so, what would that look like? And so what we did was we took the FDA definition of precision medicine and converted it over to leadership. And what does that mean? First of all, it starts with a diagnosis. How can we diagnose the needs of a group of leaders where you've got maybe, leaders that are 2 months into the job and leaders that are 20 years into the job? Leaders that lead on the inpatient side, leaders that lead on the ambulatory side. So we've created a diagnosis, a diagnostic, if you will, around skill need. And then we've also gone a step further, sort of like precision medicine, and said, let's really get under the hood and talk about learning styles. So how do I learn? Am I visual? Am I auditory? Am I kinesthetic? Do I need hands-on there? How do I learn? And then the final part of it is what I would call learning strategies. This whole notion of problem solving and critical thinking. So no matter what I do in the organization, am I good at problem solving? Am I good at critical thinking there? And out of that is the really cool part. Just like a cancer patient gets a highly individualized cancer treatment plan, the folks that we work with today, their leaders get an individualized development plan. And most importantly, one that doesn't weigh too much on their shoulders, focusing them on maybe one or two skills at a time. So we call it precision leader development. And I got to tell you, it seems to have just landed really well in the industry. I think mostly because it just feels so doable. It doesn't feel like I've got this day job and now you're asking me to get a PhD in quantum physics at the same time.
Right.
And it allows this customization, because as a leader, if it feels like I'm getting drug into this room with a one size fits all, I spend half the day figuring out how does this apply to me, versus getting a good diagnostic and then saying, oh gosh, yeah, these are the couple of skills that I could focus on. The final thing that it does is that it helps leaders that are above the middle leader team realize that one of their jobs is to become what I would call little mini chief development officers themselves. You know, some organizations will have OD, organizational development, learning and development, and often we punt to those departments and we say, you're responsible for learning and development. Well, they're really responsible for creating content. But it's really my boss. If you look at all the research, including that one from Gallup that you just referenced a while ago, if I've got a good relationship with my boss and my boss demonstrates care and concern for my development, chances of me leaving the organization drop to almost nothing. That makes sense?
Absolutely, it does. Yeah, it makes total sense. That's a great example, though, of how Healthcare Plus Solutions Group, you've evolved from the early days of StuderGroup. What other differences are there with your current organization from the approach that you were taking when you were with StuderGroup?
Yeah, I think there are a couple that I think really stand out. Number one, you know, you and I probably, if we looked at our iPhones and compared our iPhones or our Androids, they're probably less than 4 years old. You know, they're probably not necessarily the iPhone 16, but like I've got a 14. You know, I'm not using a bag phone like I used 20 years ago.
Thankfully.
I'm not using the old Motorola Razr flip phone from
but
20 years ago.
I do miss a flip phone now. I've got to tell you, Dan. I love
Android's
the flip
come out with a couple of cool models on that. But that was the first thing that we noticed is oftentimes organizations, because it just worked. You as an example, great example, the stuff that you were doing in 2007. If you were to start all over today, there would absolutely be some of those foundational things that you would want to bring along, but there'd be some new approaches to things. And maybe it's not, you know, swapping out the whole transmission of the car. Maybe it's just fine tuning, you know, kind of tightening up the lug nuts, if you will. So that's the first thing, is to make sure that 2025 problems need 2025 solutions. Number two, the solutions have to be doable. I mentioned that a while ago with leadership training. You take some of the basic tactics. I got to tell you, when we came back and saw what people were doing with rounding, one of the most foundational tactics out there, we just had to sort of shake our heads and say, oh my gosh, you know, an organization that now asks their nurse leaders to ask 12 questions when they round. So number one, what nurse leader has time to ask 12 questions? Number two,
Exactly.
what employee is going to stand there and let you ask them 12 questions when they've got work to do? And so this whole notion of making it doable is I think just really key. Number two, back to leadership development. I had a chief nursing officer named Carla Yost. She's the CNO here where I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma at Hillcrest Medical Center. And she asked probably one of the most important questions in the last several years. She came up to me after one of our learning sessions and she said, isn't it funny? We wait till someone becomes a leader to develop them. sort of your question a while ago about the MRI tech.
Right.
And so what we've also done with leadership development is take it down a layer or two. So today we're working with organizations that have, for instance, nurse practice councils, these up and comers, these rising stars. We're doing a ton of work. Matter of fact, just today we were planning a learning session right at Carla's hospital for charge nurses. You know, in our research that we funded back a couple years ago with Joslin Insight and the AONL, we found out that the use and the role of charge nurses were one of the top three impactors of whether nurses felt like it was a good day at the hospital. And so we're doing a ton of work with charge nurses, not the same stuff necessarily we'd be doing with directors and managers, but we scale that precision learning platform down to that charge nurse level there as well. And then finally, there's some things that we're still helping folks crack the code on, like how do we get along as departments? So how do support services departments and clinical departments get along even better? I guess the primary difference is that we're just much more diagnostic today versus pulling something off the shelf from 15 years ago and saying, here, try this. We try to get it's like we try to walk in the footsteps of our physician colleagues, diagnose before prescribe.
That's excellent. You know, you brought up a great point, and I want to go back to it. It's the charge nurse, because we went through this period of time where the staffing crisis was real. And we really, at least my hospital, and I think a lot of other hospitals, we screwed up this charge nurse situation because we had no choice but to give those charge nurses patients. Do you have any data out there to show the difference in quality and patient experience outcomes when your charge nurses are in staffing versus when they are not in staffing?
Yeah, actually big time data. I had just mentioned we funded some research and it's all free. Everything I'm talking about today, you can get no charge. If you go to our website and go to research, you'll see a couple of research projects that were funded by us to study the things that were happening day to day on a nursing unit. We used an organization called Joslin Insight out of the DC area, and we co-sponsored with the American Organization of Nurse Leaders. And you're exactly right. And it was with all good intentions because we were trying to get agency out of the house. And one of the ways to get agency out of the house is to give a charge nurse a full patient load. Right. But of course, when we give a charge nurse a full patient load, they might be a charge nurse in name only. Maybe we're paying them 50 cents an hour to check the crash card or something like that. But they're really not being able to be the resource that they're being asked to be to their peer nurses. And so it's amazing with the advent of this research and the things that we discovered, a number of organizations have sort of doubled down on how can we, might be phased over a year, might not happen overnight, but how can we take charge nurses out of a full staffing load? But the ones that are really doing the work are the ones that are saying, and how can we develop these charge nurses? How can we, we're calling them charges, which kind of sounds like they're in charge, but we haven't given them any development and training there. Let me give you a really interesting statistic around developing charge nurses. This organization that I was just talking about, we began with 172 charge nurses in the initial cohort of this leadership development and training. We are, call it a year and a half into the leadership development and training, and only 2 have left the organization.
I was going to ask, so the turnover's got to be just absolutely bottomed out in terms of improvements. That's great.
They're at roughly 1.1% turnover within their charge nurses.
Wow. Yeah, I finally just, as a hospital operator, I finally landed on one of the dumbest things we did in any shift was to give patients to the charge nurse, because everything, and I know why you do it. You made a great point. I mean, if we can put give patients to the charge nurse and therefore not have an agency person, but because the agency person doesn't care about your culture. They do, but only as long as they're there. So they don't care what your culture is going to look like next month or next quarter or next year. But taking that charge nurse out of the patient care responsibilities during that shift gives you opportunity to achieve every other thing that you're trying to achieve, including the finance side. They can do a better job. They can reduce your turnover of the staff. The nurses, it's data's out there. When your charge nurses don't have a patient load, your rest of your turnover goes down. I mean, it's immeasurable what a difference that one thing makes. Are you hearing hospitals say that they now realize that and they're prioritizing making sure the charge nurses don't have that patient load?
Yeah, so yes, and it's not a perfect world. There are some that it's going to take another 6 months or so to get there. But it's always good when you can lead with data. So I have the good fortune of coaching a nursing director of workforce development named Danette Staples. And Danette came from the trenches. She came from being an orthopedics floor manager. And she was the very first to draw a line in the sand and take her charge nurses completely out of a patient load. And the first time she showed me her data, it was like, well, what else are we thinking here? So in her orthopedics floor, which is, they're a tough floor. This was her data once she made this commitment to her charge nurses, length of stay down materially, falls all but disappeared, employee engagement highest in the organization, and patient experience at the top decile. Oh, by the way, throw in the quality metrics that you measure on an orthopedics floor. She had 5 metrics in a row. And when I asked her, I said, okay, push comes to shove, what was it? She said it was my charge nurses.
I believe it.
At that point, what else do you have to argue with there?
I believe it. Well, I would challenge every single C-suite person in a hospital that is listening to this podcast. It is, we're recording this in May of 2025. I would encourage you to have no greater priority to achieve one thing by the end of this year, and that is to consistently not have a patient load with your charge nurses. I have seen it. Your data supports it. I don't know if there's anything that should be a higher priority for an organization if they're in a situation where their charge nurses have a patient load, because you're going to fight the battle on every other metric that you're trying to pursue if you haven't achieved that one thing. Would you agree or disagree with that?
No, I'd agree. It's kind of like just clearing the sand out of the gears. When charges are bearing a pretty full patient load, it can feel like there's a lot of sand in the gears because it's just hard to get stuff done.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Dan, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for investing time in doing this. I know our listeners got a lot out of your thoughts.
Well, it's my pleasure. You're one of those guys. It's been so fun. I was looking back. People call me a pack rat. I like to think of myself as an archivist, but I was I save everything. And I was looking back through our LinkedIn messages at all the places that you were and all the places that I was there. But the common thread is every time we'd connect, it was around something like this. And you were always such a great role model for hospital CEOs that were in places that might have had all the excuses they needed not to do well. And, when you can just kind of clear the excuses away and say, what can we do? What are we going to do? Then it's just all the better.
Wow. Thank you. That was very kind of you. But I'm so glad, going from 2007 to 2025, we have gone our different paths, but we're back together today for this. And I just appreciate you so much.
Well, thanks for having me today, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Healthcare Badlands podcast. As always, please like and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. If you have suggestions for topics or guests, please email those to podcast@badlands.pro. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. Some information shared may include fictitious names. The opinions expressed are solely those of the host and/or guests and are their own and not reflective of the opinions of others or our sponsors. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you'll join us on the next episode of the Healthcare Badlands podcast. Until then,